Have you ever wondered why Jesus didn't say, I am the meat of life, or I am the fruit or vegetable of life? No, he said, I'm the bread of life. And all throughout the Bible, bread appears repeatedly as the substance of life. But the bread in Bible times used none of the modern damaging refining methods that we use today. And this product on our store shelves is so far removed from the exquisite, nutritious, whole grain food of Jesus' day. Hello and welcome. I'm Joanne Jolee. So I've been making whole grain bread for over 40 years, but just a few years ago I took it all to a higher level. Short of growing my own grains, I wanted the authentic, I wanted the ancient, the wild yeast bread. It's also known as sourdough, made most likely in the same way Sarah made bread for Abraham or some similar method. Authentic bread has only 3 parts to it. You've got the grain, the salt, and the water, and then you have a living starter which is created from the yeast in the air. So as well as being the most nutritious bread product available, there are so many spiritual lessons we can get from bread and the analogies to the kingdom of God in the Bible. So here are a few points to encourage you to reconsider the bread product that you consume. And I'll throw in a few scriptures along the way. Oh, and authentic bread is very difficult to find. And when you find it, it's expensive. So I say you should learn to make it yourself. And at the end, I'm going to demonstrate my whole process for making this most nutritious, savagely delicious bread of life. So wheat, along with barley, is the most mentioned grain in the Bible. It's also one of the most highly cultivated and used grains in the whole world. This is because of its adaptability to different climates and the different growing conditions around the world. It's to the versatility of the grain. There's so many things you can do with the wheat berries. It's not a complete protein, but when you combine it with other grains, it can make a complete protein, everything you need for sustenance. Wheat has a longer shelf life and it can be stored for times of scarcity, like when Pharaoh told Joseph to store up grain for 7 years famine. It was highly likely wheat and barley. So now let's consider how much wheat product you eat daily. Sandwiches, pasta, pizza, tortillas, hamburgers and hot dogs, cake, cookies, crackers, pancakes, waffles, cereals, donuts. As they're purchased in our major grocery chains, made with white flour, almost no nutritional value due to the massive overprocessing, and it's been infused with chemicals and additives. Sometimes they even add bleach just to make the flour whiter. The problem with modern store-bought bread is that it's not bread. In fact, one country brought a lawsuit against Subway. This was back in 2020. They told them, you have to stop using the word bread to describe the product of the sandwiches, because even by today's standard of what constitutes bread, it doesn't qualify. The Supreme Court of Ireland rules that Subway bread legally isn't bread because the added sugar is 5 times what the law deems acceptable, and they said it's more like cake. White flour is made from the whole berries by a process that removes the bran, which is the outer layer, and the germ, which is the very nutrient-rich part of the wheat kernel, and it leaves behind the endosperm, which is primarily starch. So removing the bran, removing the germ eliminates much of the fiber, if not all of it, vitamins and minerals and the antioxidants that are found in the whole wheat berry. And then, to compensate for the loss of these nutrients during this refining process, some of the white breads are fortified. They put some vitamins and minerals back, like the B's, folic acid, various vitamins. But there's no way to recreate that natural product, which is rich in the nutrients that we know about, and many others we probably don't know about that haven't been discovered yet. So then that refined flour is mixed with other things like salt and sugar and fats like oil, butter. And then there is a commercially made yeast that helps the dough to rise to that soft, white, fluffy product. This white bread has a higher glycemic index, which causes quicker spikes in the blood sugar compared to the whole grain breads. And of course, the lack of fiber in the white bread means that you don't get as much fullness, which leads people often to just overeat. So a few warnings about whole wheat bread. Even when you purchase bread that's labeled whole wheat or whole grain, you may be getting a white bread with a percentage of whole wheat flour mixed in. Now, in the United States, for example, we have the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, and it requires for a bread to be labeled whole wheat that it must contain at least 51% whole wheat flour by weight. So that means 49% of the flour in the bread could be refined white. There is some bread labeled 100% whole wheat that has been made with the whole grain, but then they separate out the parts into the bran, germ, and endosperm, and then they reconstitute them in different proportions. So while the flour is technically considered 100% whole wheat because it does contain all the parts of the grain, it's not the same as when you're using the intact, unprocessed wheat kernel directly. You really don't know the nutritional content of that flour. So that leads us to the stone ground whole wheat, which is a full wheat product where the wheat kernels are ground using the traditional stone grinding mills, and supposedly they are grinding the entire wheat berry into the flour. However, even the stone ground whole wheat flour can vary because some mills, in some cases, separate the parts of the wheat kernel out and then they recombine them for whatever reason, I don't know. But the only way to be certain that you're getting the whole grain is to purchase the berries yourself and mill them. So the fresh milled flour means the bread retains all the parts, the bran, the germ, the endosperm, making it the highest level of all the vitamins that you can get from the grain, all the minerals. It has the highest fiber content, so important for your digestive health. It helps to regulate your blood sugar levels, helps to lower your cholesterol, which of course contributes to a reduced risk of heart disease. And the carbohydrates are much more complex, which results in a slower release of sugar into the bloodstream, which helps to maintain more stable blood sugar levels. And this really makes a good option for people managing diabetes. We have a diabetic in the family, and he can easily tolerate the wild yeast authentic bread because of this. For the entire world history, authentic bread was only made with wild yeast until about 100 years ago. That's when commercial yeast became available. This was around the mid-1800s when it was discovered that it was a living organism responsible for the bread rising process. And for the first time, it allowed bread to be made not in days, but in hours. The outcome was controlled, it was predictable, and this revolutionized bread production. So the main difference between modern commercial yeast and the wild yeast is that commercial yeast is a single strain. It's a single strain yeast. It's grown in controlled environments for mass production, whereas the wild yeast for authentic bread comes from the environment, the air, whatever's floating around in our house and our kitchen. It's a mixture of a variety of yeast strains and some lactic acid bacteria also. These naturally ferment over time. It's not as predictable as the commercial yeast, but it does create a more complex microbial community, which is much better for your digestive system as well. The commercial yeast works very quickly. Its job is to produce the gas to make the bread rise quickly, whereas the wild yeast takes much longer to ferment, 12 to 24 hours really. The flavors produced by the commercial yeast are neutral, nothing really, as it's focusing mainly on leavening with the gas, whereas the wild yeast produces a far more nuanced, tangy, slightly sour flavor, which is where it gets its name, sourdough. I wanted to note the Ezekiel Bread, which is a complete protein product, and it's readily available in the major food markets, and it comes from a recipe in Ezekiel 4. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Now, the context of this was a coming siege against Jerusalem, where the people suffered extreme deprivation. They would be forced to eat impure food as the city was surrounded and the food supplies were cut off. And this bread was not about some happy recipe for your good health. It was associated with defilement. And the full picture is just really nasty. If you read that chapter, God told Ezekiel to bake it over human excrement as a symbol of the impurity and the hardship that was coming on the people of Israel. And we read that Ezekiel protested, and so the Lord allowed him to use cow dung instead. But the bread itself, with the sprouted grain mix, constituted a complete protein. It would have been sustaining in times of scarcity. But I personally don't eat the Ezekiel bread because the process does use commercial yeast, and they add in some gluten to help with the rise. But this bread is a night and day upgrade to anything made with white flour, and I would recommend it. In the Bible, bread appears repeatedly as the substance of life, with Jesus even referring to himself as, you know, the bread of life. Wheat is often used symbolically in the New Testament to represent growth and nourishment and the distinction between the righteous and the wicked. It's closely tied to themes of sustenance, spiritual fulfillment, divine provision, and wheat is the good seed. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, the enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The wheat represents the righteous, while the weeds represent the wicked. This parable illustrates how the righteous and the wicked are going to grow up together until the time of harvest, the judgment. And then the wicked will be separated and cast away. And Jesus went further and explained to his disciples, the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. And the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The sower of the good seed is Jesus. But the kingdom of God is also compared to yeast. And he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Yeast is more often used negatively, but here the yeast illustrates how a small amount when mixed into the dough can gradually and completely transform the entire mixture. And this signifies how the influence of God's kingdom can subtly spread and affect a large number of people, even though it may start with something insignificant or seemingly insignificant in the beginning. Essentially, the leaven represents the power of God's work to change lives from within, working quietly and pervasively until the whole is transformed. The yeast works unseen within the dough, so the kingdom of God can operate quietly and subtly in people's lives. The yeast gradually leavens the dough, similar to how the kingdom of God grows over time through the influence of believers. Remember Daniel's vision, the kingdom of God coming as a stone and becoming a large rock that fills the whole earth. Jesus said, "I'm the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." Jesus is the bread of life. He brings satisfaction. He is all the way nutritious and lovely. It's interesting that different cultures reveal Jesus in their different ways. He's the bread of life. He's not the grain of life. Grain is something that God makes. Bread is something that people make out of the grain that God makes with the particular varieties of the yeast common to that location. And isn't that what culture is? It's a mixture of what God created and then man's creativity. Think about that. And now I'm going to show you how I make my wild yeast authentic wheat bread. There are so many ways to produce this bread. The yeast is very forgiving, I think, but there is a learning curve. It can be frustrating, so try and try and try again. But I'm going to give you a secret tip. Every failure on the journey to producing that artisan loaf is delicious. The flat loaf you see on the left there, that left me feeling horribly defeated, but actually it was delicious. So failure is just not a word to go along with bread making. It's just a clue as to what you might try next to get a better result. So the first thing you're going to do is give your starter a feed. You want to get it strengthened, ready to work, rise it to about double. It takes about 3 to 5 hours depending on what the air temperature is and the humidity. Creating a starter is another process that I'm not going to go over here, but once you have established your starter, it only needs to be fed once a week or so, and it really becomes part of the family. It's living. Some people even name their starter. So I grind up my wheat berries in my Vitamix. You can buy a wheat mill, but my Vitamix works really great if I just use the dry container. Combine 450 grams of milled wheat, 325 grams of water at room temperature, mine's filtered, 10 grams of salt, 70 grams of bubbly starter. I knead the dough for about 15 minutes until it's smooth and it's showing strength and holding together. A bit of a shine on it. Currently I use my old commercial yeast bread maker on the dough cycle. When that's done, I cover it, set it aside at room temperature to bulk ferment for about 4 to 6 hours. The final 2 hours I do a stretch and fold about every 30 minutes to further help strengthen the dough. Then I shape it on the counter and I pull to create some tension on the surface. Try not to disturb the bubbles in the dough. Pack it up into the fridge overnight for the long ferment, which really helps develop that deep, rustic, authentic flavor. The next day, bake for 25 minutes at 450 in the Dutch oven. Uncover for about 15 more minutes until you get the brown color you like. When it comes out of the oven, it needs to rest on the counter for about an hour to finish that cooking process. My grandkids can't wait for their weekly piano lessons, so they can come over and devour this treat. I always have a fresh loaf for them when they come. By the way, the cost per loaf that I worked out, if you buy the stone ground wheat from the store, is about 50 cents per loaf. And I have seen the artisan loaves online for about $10. Enjoy. With the smallest mustard seed.